How's it going, ladies and gents? My name's Jeff, aka Son of Mar, on the PlayStation Network. I am healthy, finally. Well, 80% healthy, but whatever. So, for this episode of Dear PlayStation, for those of you that don't know what Dear PlayStation is, it is everything about PlayStation. Good, bad, ugly, all that bullshit. It is a love letter to PlayStation, and also sometimes hate mail. So, this episode, there hasn't, again, been that much news going on. I mean, recently, what was it? The PlayStation Experience date got announced. So that's really the newest thing for PlayStation, other than probably the No Man's Sky debacle, which I'm not gonna really talk about that much, just because I don't know. That's a hairy subject that I don't have enough of an opinion to really give on in terms of the board for England looking into the possible false advertising claims. Because I feel for people that feel like they got deceived, but end of the day, the game over and over again was shown to be pretty much what you'd expect. But it's also one of those cases where what was being said of it, Sean Murray was billing it as bigger than it was, but it was being shown consistently as the same thing. So it's really one of those things where I think people bought into the hype man that is Sean Murray, which he is a great hype man. But again, I'm not going to talk about this episode. I really don't want to talk about that. Instead, I want to talk about, again, kind of like last week, where I talked about the Getaway and why I think it could come back, and in what way it could be coming back in the form of, with VR, the London Heist edition to the VR Worlds. There are a plethora of other PlayStation classics and titles that I think deserve to get another chance, right? And I think I'm going to talk about an obvious one this week. A very, very obvious one, but also one I think that people kind of sometimes don't think about too often. That is Resistance. Now, for those of you that don't know what Resistance is, Resistance was a PlayStation 3 title / trilogy, unless you count the PSP games, in which there were two, because there was Burning Skies, and I think there was one other one. I think. Or maybe it was a Vita game. I think there was a PSP game and a Vita game, if I remember right. I could be wrong on that. Either way, the main trilogy, it's kind of like Killzone, where there's like... Killzone is pretty much like Killzone 1 through 3, and then Shadowfall. Like, those are the four main Killzone games. There are, I think, two other ones. Because there's Liberation, and I think there's one other one. Liberation was a really good PSP game. And I think there might be one other one. So I think there are in total 5 or 6 Killzone games. Whereas Resistance has 4 or 5 altogether. But Resistance, its trilogy was solid. And I think it got better with each game. Resistance 1, really cool concept, decent controls, decent character development. But really, I mean, the story overall is kind of basic. It was the world that it built, the alternate timeline that was made, and the intriguing mechanic and changes to the situation of what would happen if World War II was pretty much interrupted / almost ended by an alien invasion. How would that prompt and change the humanity, essentially? And that's what that game was pretty much about, with the Chimera versus humanity. And it was a very interesting game. It was one that I kind of wished, though, almost went into more of a detail and more of an investment into almost like the middle of the war. So you still fought the war while fighting the Chimera, right? I think that would have been really fucking cool and really interesting. And the reason why I think that is because, in my opinion, I think it would be really cool to, for instance, to be part of the Russian force, for instance, in fighting against the Chimera and the Nazis during the winter in Russia during that campaign. I think that would have been fucking sick. But I think the trilogy as a whole was really solid. It was very unique in what it did. Resistance 2 was an improvement on Resistance. Resistance 3 was the best one, though, by far. It had not amazing, but it had a fantastic story. It had a much stronger story. It had a much more strong, character-driven narrative. It just overall was a better compiled game collectively, which is why I think it was such a great game, because it was. And plus it had really fun co-op. I remember the first time I played it all of it, but the very beginning of the game with my buddy. Like, I missed the first chapter with him, and we played the rest of it in one sitting. Like, we pretty much played it all day together, and it was amazing. Like, we experienced this game together. I remember when we finished it, we both kind of looked at each other, high-fived, and went, I told him, I was like, I have not played a co-op game like this since I was a kid, since I played Halo 2 with my buddies, Halo 3 with my buddies. I haven't played co-op like this in a long time. And he was like, I haven't either. And for our two college guys to bond over a game like that, it was a really unique experience for me. It was a very fun experience. It was a special experience for me because it resonates a lot with me. Resistance 3. So I've rambled enough about the kind of the background of Resistance. I want to speak to why I think it deserves to not only come back, but deserves to it deserves another game in general. So Resistance ended on a pretty strong note, but it wasn't a definitive note. It, it for spoiler alert for everyone listening. I'm going to say this 3 times: spoiler alert, spoiler alert, spoiler alert. All right. So for those of you that are going to get pissed off later, possibly that I spoiled the story details and the ending of Resistance 3, I've warned you by this point. So the third game ends pretty much with Joe saving the world. Duh. From the Chimera. Pretty much he destroys the for lack of a better word and for lack of context, he destroys like one of their hubs that's causing like a lot of storms, and that's essentially terraforming Earth into what the Chimera want. It's changing the climate, it's changing the land, it's doing a lot of crazy shit. It's kind of like what Man of Steel had happening, right? So with that in mind, they won. He saved his wife, he saved his kid, and he was able to go back to them. But here's the thing: he only destroyed one of those machines. There are several of them still up and running. So the franchise still had an open window in it, right? Where there are a lot of other stories that could be told, but they haven't been told yet, because Joe's story pretty much really was tied to Resistance 2. Because Hale from Resistance 2 and Resistance 1 was the main character before getting killed in Resistance 2 by none other than Joe. Because Hale, at the end of Resistance 2, he was succumbing to the Chimera virus because he got infected. I think it was Resistance 2 that he got infected. Maybe it was Resistance 1. I forget which one it is off the top of my head. But he got infected with it, and he was living with it and fighting with it for a long time. But at the end of Resistance 2, he was basically succumbing to it, and then Joe killed him. And then he was dishonorably discharged for pretty much killing the hero. And the funny thing is that a lot of other people were suffering from the same thing Hale was. And his body, because he survived with it so long, and he was killed right before he changed, he essentially became the final gift of his body was a antivirus, or a vaccine, a serum, if you will, to cure anyone else that has this issue. And it was crazy. And Joe was, hated. He was a martyr despite doing the right thing, and that was pretty much the beginning of Resistance 3, and you kind of get the mindset of who he is. So, Resistance, amazing franchise. Fantastic franchise. But the question gets begged, though, like, how would it get picked up, right? There's a couple ways I think that could get picked back up. There's the easy way, which is, just rebooting, starting over, take the lessons that are learned from 1, 2, and 3, especially 3, and concoct a brand new version of Resistance that has a better focused story, better characters, and better world building, but still has the great concepts that were introduced, and then mixes in some new things, right? The other thing that could be done is a direct sequel, right? And a direct sequel, not a bad idea at all. I mean, that's a smart idea. It would work really well. The only thing is that it's been so long since Resistance 3 came out. I think it came out 5 or 6 years ago, that you'd have to bank on the fact that the audience, especially on the PlayStation, but also players that never played Resistance, the Xbox fans that converted over the PS4 and whatnot, you'd have to bank on the fact that they would be interested enough to know the backstory, for one thing, and that you would have the ability to craft a good enough of a intro sequence to Resistance 4 that would fill in the blanks of 1 through 3, right? Because you do have to fill in that blank, big time. I think Infamous Second Son did a really good job of that, where it was like, okay, we're going to do a really glossed over version of it where we don't go into too much detail, but we give you enough of a backstory to kind of get an idea of what the circumstances for this world is when it comes to conduits and superhumans, you know. Same thing could be said of really Killzone Shadowfall. I think that did a pretty solid job of giving some backstory. Um, and I think Uncharted 4 honestly does a pretty damn good job of giving some good background. So I think Resistance 4, if it was a direct sequel, wouldn't have that big of a hill to climb. But because it is 3 games and it did have quite a bit happen in those 3 games, it would still have to fight for it. But the same could be said of a lot of other games that if a sequel comes out for like Sly Cooper 5 eventually, then it would have to do the same thing. Um, a lot of games would have to fight with that problem in some ways if they were story driven in any type of heavy capacity, right? Ni no Kuni 2 is going to have to do it. If there was ever going to be another Jack and Daxter, it would definitely have to do it. Um, and that would be a problem in its own because of the Lost Frontier and everything. So, all in all, in my opinion, I think Resistance would be better off just rebooting, because then you get a clean slate. You keep the concepts, but you can kind of weave your own narrative and choose a new path, a more interesting path. Honestly, I think it'd be kind of cool to see what Resistance 3 did and kind of mix in, this almost like militant militia type of vibe to it during World War II, the freedom fighters, if you will, of like Poland maybe, I think that'd be fucking cool. And then you can kind of mix in what the concepts of, Christ, what's the name of the game that just, Homefront, the new Homefront I was supposed to do, the concepts of basically being a militant resistance fighter. You can mix in stuff like that into the gameplay, that you can use crafting into the game, and in the first person you can craft together environmental stuff to create whatever weapons you want, right? It'd be really cool, I think. But I trust Insomniac to eventually, if they're ever given the green light with Sony to make another one, which I think they have. I think it's just a question of when they'll make it. Because, they're busy doing a whole bunch of other shit. So, I do think it will eventually get made. But we'll see. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I'm done rambling. Let me know what you guys think. Let me know if you think another Resistance deserves to get made. If you think there are other games that deserve a higher priority on the list than Resistance. If there are other games that you'd like to hear my opinion on, in terms of getting brought back, games that should be ended, because I'm actually going to do that in the next episode where I'm going to talk about a franchise that should take a break for a while, and so on and so forth. So without further ado, thank you guys. Love each and every one of you. Hit the like and sub button if you would so kindly. And as always, you guys have a great one.